Hello everyone, and welcome to this Diablo 3 dungeon guide for the Demon Hunter Natalya's Vengeance set. We'll be going over how to set up your character, and I'll also explain how to complete both primary dungeon objectives. Keep watching until the end to see a full playthrough of the entire set dungeon with additional tips. To get started, let's first take a look at the set bonuses so we'll know how to gear out our character. This set revolves around the Rain of Vengeance skill. Casting it significantly increases our damage and toughness, so we will want to make sure to cast it frequently throughout the dungeon. The 2-piece set bonus provides cooldown reduction on Rain of Vengeance anytime we hit with a hatred spending or generating attack. Since the base cooldown on the skill is 30 seconds, this is an important mechanic to take advantage of, and we'll want to ensure we are constantly hitting monsters to reset Rain of Vengeance as much and as quickly as possible. The primary dungeon objectives sync up pretty well with the set playstyle, requiring us to constantly keep casting Rain of Vengeance and to avoid letting our hatred resource run completely out. Therefore, considering all of this, hatred generation, resource cost reduction, and cooldown reduction will be the main priorities for the gearing and skills setup. We will also want to make sure our damage output is relatively low to ensure monsters can stay alive for a few hits in lieu of being one-shotted to help reduce the Rain of Vengeance cooldown. In this setup, we are using 5 of the 7 set pieces in the torso, hands, legs, finger, and weapon slots. In the head slot, we have Leoric's Crown, which provides increased resource cost reduction with a topaz equipped in the helm. In the shoulder slot, we take Mantle of Channeling. We will be using Strafe as our main damage dealing skill, and these shoulders will provide us both increased damage and toughness. In the feet slot, we have Illusory Boots, which allows us to freely move through monsters and other obstacles. In this dungeon, it is vital to move from pack to pack of monsters expeditiously to continue getting hits for the Rain of Vengeance cooldown reset. While moving through the monsters won't be an issue while using the Strafe skill, the elites in this dungeon cast walls, which can trap and prevent us from moving to the next group of enemies quickly. The walls will also prevent the projectiles we shoot from passing through and continuing to get hits on nearby monsters. Illusory Boots completely negate the impact of these walls, giving us one less thing to have to worry about and focus on during the dungeon, so definitely get these boots if you can. In the wrist slot, we take Reaper's Wraps for increased hatred generation. And in the waist slot, we have Vigilante's Belt. This belt doesn't have a special legendary power, but it does come with an inherent cooldown reduction stat. In the offhand slot, there are no overly beneficial items, so take anything with good damage output or toughness as needed. Stay away from any legendary powers that buff the damage of skills unnecessarily, since we want our damage output to be relatively low. Strongly consider leaving this offhand slot completely empty to reduce damage output if needed. In the next slot, we have a Hellfire Amulet. There are a few passives that may provide a small benefit. Just stay away from skills that increase damage output unnecessarily. And in the second finger slot, we have Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac, which provides some excellent cooldown reduction. This ring has great synergy with this build, and is critical to being able to keep Rain of Vengeance up. It is not recommended to attempt the dungeon without it. When it comes to rerolling stats on the gear, the top priorities are cooldown reduction and resource cost reduction, as mentioned previously. Then take anything that increases survivability. Again, be careful about adjusting stats to increase damage output too much. For Kanai's Cube in the weapon slot, we have Engium, which reduces skill cooldown after killing elite monsters. In the armor slot, we take Hexing Pants of Mr. Yan, particularly for the resource generation. Having this legendary power equipped will give you a much easier time managing your hatred resource. It is not recommended to attempt this dungeon without it. And in the jewelry slot, we have Ring of Royal Grandeur, which allows us to gain the 6-piece set bonus while only having 5 of the 7 set pieces equipped. For gems, we have a Topaz in the head slot for resource cost reduction, diamonds in the torso and leg slots for toughness, and an amethyst in the weapon slot. For legendary gems, we have Esoteric Alteration for a toughness increase, Gogok of Swiftness specifically for its cooldown reduction, and lastly, Molten Wildebeest Gizzard for life regeneration. For Paragon, the main priorities are movement speed, maximum hatred, cooldown reduction, and resource cost reduction. Remember to unassign points in any damage-related stats if you need to lower damage output. Next, let's go over the skills. We'll be using Rain of Vengeance, which is mandatory, with the Shade rune. Next, we have Strafe with the Drifting Shadow rune. We use this skill because of the ability to stay on the move while casting it, allowing us to constantly be hitting monsters and reducing Rain of Vengeance cooldown. Next, we take Companion with the Bat Companion rune, and Preparation with the Punishment rune. Both of these skills provide on-demand hatred generation and should be cast whenever hatred needs to be refilled. Next, we take Vault with the Tumble rune for increased mobility, and then we take Evasive Fire with the Focus rune. This skill is only taken as a precaution and should only be used if hatred is nearly empty and both Companion and Preparation are on cooldown. However, ideally, we shouldn't need to use it, since we should have plenty of hatred generation with the other gear and skills already mentioned. For the passive skills, we have Blood Vengeance for increased hatred generation, and then Tactical Advantage and Hot Pursuit, both which provide increased movement speed. And lastly, we take Night Stalker for additional increased hatred generation. Now let's go over the dungeon objectives. The first primary dungeon objective is to maintain a constant Rain of Vengeance for 90 seconds. Rain of Vengeance lasts for 5 seconds, so you'll need to repeatedly cast the skill before it expires each time for 90 consecutive seconds. The skill only lasts 5 seconds, but its base cooldown is 30 seconds. So it is critical to reduce its cooldown through the use of the 2-piece set bonus mechanic by hitting enemies. The The goal is to hit monsters, not kill them. To do this, you'll be attacking with a strafe skill through nearly the whole dungeon. While strafing, you'll want to stay on the edges of packs of monsters, where you can hit several at a time, but not an excessive amount of them. Every few seconds, you'll cast Rain of Vengeance. Ideally, you'll initially cast it into empty space until you complete the first objective, to avoid killing monsters with it unnecessarily. You'll want to save the enemies for your strafe hits. A good approach is to cast Rain of Vengeance behind you, to damage stragglers you may have passed as you continue into fresh new monster packs. As your hatred is dropping while strafing, you'll cast Companion and Preparation to keep it filled. If your hatred is getting very low, then stand still and cast Evasive Fire, but only for a second or two. Make sure to keep an eye on the Rain of Vengeance cooldown. The second primary dungeon objective is to not exhaust your hatred. This objective is extremely simple. Don't let your hatred resource get completely empty. You'll be casting Strafe for nearly the entire dungeon, constantly putting a drain on your hatred, so be ready to cast Companion and Preparation when they're available. And if needed, stop casting Strafe and switch to Evasive Fire to generate some resource to avoid hitting 0. Just don't abandon Strafe for too long, because you will need it to help reset your Rain of Vengeance cooldown. While straightforward, this dungeon objective is made difficult because of the sensory overload during the dungeon run. You will need to focus on a lot of things simultaneously during the run. There's cooldowns on the skill bar, like Rain of Vengeance to ensure it's kept up, and the Companion and Preparation to keep hatred refilled. There's the hatred resource level, and then there's the minimap. You'll probably just need a few dungeon attempts to practice managing all these different elements. Also, be sure to study the dungeon map provided in the next section of this guide. The more familiar you are with the dungeon layout ahead of time will give you a better chance of completing this objective, since it will be one less thing to worry about. Next, let's take a look at the dungeon map. This dungeon is relatively small, and it is easy to run out of monsters for completing the dungeon objectives if you kill enemies too quickly. The best approach is to first just serpentine your way through it, slowly hitting and killing monsters as you go, aiming to complete the first primary dungeon objective of maintaining Rain of Vengeance for 90 seconds. During this phase, the main priority is always having monsters available to hit. You'll want to constantly have eyes on monsters on your minimap, so you have an idea of where to head next and how fast you'll need to move to get there. Leave behind stragglers and always be headed into a group with several fresh new monsters. Once you've completed the first objective, then you'll finish the dungeon by passing back through it a second time to clear any areas where you may have inadvertently or purposefully left monsters behind. There is plenty of time to cover the entire dungeon twice. Make sure to study the map and route before attempting the dungeon. There are a lot of things to focus on, and if you take the wrong route, you can end up in an area with no enemies to hit, ruining your run. So now that you have the setup and you know how to approach the dungeon, let's head to it. Go to Act 1, then to the Wortham Chapel Cellar Waypoint. From there, head through the portal to Wortham. The dungeon entrance is right at the drop-off location. And next, we'll look at the playthrough. For this run, I went with pretty bare-bones gear to demonstrate techniques. I had to equip Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac to have sufficient cooldown reduction for keeping Rain of Vengeance active. Any additional items or stats that you get, consistent with the recommendations earlier, will give you a much easier time completing the dungeon. Once inside the dungeon, get to the first enemies. Then cast Rain of Vengeance behind you and start strafing. Keep an eye on your Rain of Vengeance cooldown and cast it every few seconds. Always try to place it behind you where you've already been so you don't hit too many new monsters. You want to save them for strafe hits to help reduce the Rain of Vengeance cooldown. As soon as you see your hatred level get to about half, then cast Companion or Preparation, and start serpentining your way through the dungeon map. During the first part of the dungeon, you will want to focus on the first objective and try to stretch out killing monsters as much as possible. Try to stay on the edges of larger monster packs instead of plowing into the middle of them. This will kill monsters at a slower rate and give more bodies to hit to continue resetting the Rain of Vengeance cooldown. Keeping the 90-second Rain of Vengeance streak going can be pretty stressful. You need to constantly shift your eyes between your Rain of Vengeance cooldown, your Companion and Preparation cooldowns, your hatred level, and your minimap. Just keep shifting your eyes around constantly to take it all in. Unfortunately, if you mess up your 90-second streak, then you'll most likely have to start the dungeon over again. You just won't have enough monsters remaining to reset the Rain of Vengeance cooldown enough times. Just don't be discouraged if you need a few attempts to get the dungeon completed. It will take some practice to get the right rhythm down for managing your skill cooldowns and knowing how often you need to cast Rain of Vengeance. Try to stick to the route recommended earlier in the dungeon map section of this guide, but if you're familiar enough with the dungeon layout, it's okay to deviate. Go where the monster packs take you, just don't get stuck in one of the corners with no monsters to continue your Rain of Vengeance streak. And there, we completed the first primary dungeon objective after 90 consecutive seconds. Now we just focus on clearing the remaining enemies. The high run speed in the build is needed to get from monster pack to monster pack faster, but it's not a factor for clearing the dungeon in time. You should have plenty of time remaining, so don't rush, and definitely keep an eye on your hatred level. Make sure to keep casting Rain of Vengeance even after completing the first objective, because you will need the damage and toughness increases from the set bonuses. And of course, now we can cast Rain of Vengeance directly on monster packs to help kill them. The elite monsters will periodically summon purple rings on the ground that will teleport you if you're caught by one. Try to avoid these, particularly in the first part of the dungeon, because they can disrupt your rhythm trying to complete the first primary dungeon objective. The elites also can hit pretty hard, so stay away from their big frontal melee swings. After reaching the end of the dungeon map, we head back toward the entrance, uncovering the rest of the minimap and clearing out the residual enemies. It is not recommended to assign a follower in this dungeon, they will just get in the way. Just a few monsters left. And we're done. Good luck trying to finish this one. If you enjoyed the guide and would like to see more content, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.